This video is brought to you by Squarespace, the all-in-one platform where entrepreneurs can easily create and customize their own personal or professional website. More on Squarespace later in the video.
So hello and welcome to yet another episode of Biographics. I'm your interim host Karl Smallwood, and today we're talking about King Henry VIII, England's larger-than-life monarch. And as with all of the videos here at Biographics, this one is based on a script submitted to us by a member of our writing team, that being Ben Edelman, whose social links you can find below alongside my own. Of all the kings that have ever ruled over England, perhaps the most famous is King Henry VIII, being remembered in posterity as a highly sought-after attribute in a monarch, though Henry would most likely not be all too pleased with the way in which he is remembered, as a fat tyrant who went through women quicker than he did clothes, and who was overly fond of chopping people's heads off. He cuts an almost comedic figure today, particularly for having 6 different wives, which admittedly is a lot even in the modern era unless your name is Rod Stewart, and much less so in the 16th century. When he was alive though, nobody was laughing at King Henry. His personal marital troubles spilled over into the English Reformation and the transition of his country from Catholicism to Protestantism. Is that how you say that? Protestantism? I've never seen that word. Which had a profound impact on Europe and later the entire world. In his time, Henry was beloved by the common people. Any faults in his character were overlooked and blamed instead on evil counsellors, which explain why so many of the courtiers that jockeyed for power underneath him ended up on the chopping block alongside his wives. To those that knew him, Henry could be a generous and loyal friend, but everyone quickly learned to fear his explosive temper, which could be triggered at the slightest provocation. When he was angry, it didn't matter how close to him you were in serious danger, as several of his wives will attest to. Probably his biggest character flaw was that at some point he began to earnestly believe his own hype, that he truly was a perfect monarch anointed by God to rule his realm, and one that didn't really need the guidance or advice of anyone underneath him. Under his rule, the kingdom reached the very heights of absolute monarchy, as Henry leaned more on fear than love to keep his subjects in line. This granted him almost unparalleled levels of power and wealth, but also had consequences that his descendants will be grappling with for centuries after he shuffled off this mortal coil. But let's start, as we often do, at the beginning. Prince Henry was born on June 28, 1491 in Greenwich Palace to the west of central London. His father, King Henry VII, who saw that one coming, had come to power just 6 years earlier when he defeated and killed Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field, winning the War of the Roses and founding the Tudor dynasty. Initially, he wasn't supposed to become the king. That honour belonged to his older brother Arthur, the Prince of Wales, but everything changed in April 1502 when Arthur suddenly became ill and died at the age of 15, leaving the 11-year-old Henry as the heir apparent to the throne. Henry VII died in 1509 of tuberculosis, or consumption as it was sometimes known back then, and after a short regency, his son was crowned King Henry VIII on his 18th birthday. As a young man, Henry was largely uninterested in the day-to-day running of his realm, leaving the business to his advisors, principally Thomas Wolsey, Cardinal Archbishop of York. Instead, Henry spent much of his time at play. The early parts of his reign were filled with feasts, dances, tournaments, and behind the scenes, all manner of sexual exploits. Henry was also, contrary to the idea we have of him today, a pretty active outdoorsman in his youth, spending his time doing things like hunting, playing sports, and just scaring the out of his advisors by participating in jousting tournaments with other young nobles of the realm, a dangerous pastime that could have easily maimed or killed him, and later did at least one of those things. As for appearances, Henry VIII was about 6 foot 2 inches tall, so he towered over most of his contemporaries, and was also considered to be quite handsome and muscular. For example, he had a 50-inch chest, and his armour, which still stands at the Tower of London, is among the biggest they have on display. Henry was also considered to be exceptionally well read. This was the start of the Renaissance after all, and many works of ancient Greece and Rome were being rediscovered, and new philosophies of thought based on those ancient texts were being expounded by learned men across Europe. Henry considered himself to be a humanist. A student of this new school routinely read ancient history and contemporary works of philosophy, astronomy, and history, among other things. He also had a colossal ego, a firm believer in the divine right of kings. He was the first English monarch to be addressed as Your Majesty instead of Your Highness. He spent vast sums of money projecting his power and splendour as propaganda to showcase his majestas to a culture that was still mostly illiterate. The things that Henry would spend money on included, but was not limited to, clothing and jewellery, massive quantities of food and alcohol, and above all else, his magnificent palaces and estates, which Henry would spend huge amounts of cash to renovate throughout his reign. He actually owned more houses than any British monarch ever has, or since. And I know you're probably enjoying that video, but it's time for a word from today's sponsor. But I don't like doing sponsors and stuff alone, so anteater me. And today's sponsor is Squarespace.
Yeah, Squarespace.
I'm joined off camera by Brad and Nisha. Who threw the anteater?
Not me.
Okay, because I think you got some spiral on that anteater was flying. Last time, yesterday, I thought you were going to throw it into my hands. I didn't expect it to be on a radar screen.
I thought I'd accidentally stop the recording or something because it hit the computer.
It's fine, it's fine. And do you know what else is fine? Today's sponsor, Squarespace. So tell me about today's sponsor, off camera, Brad and Nisha, who apparently have a thing against anteaters.
So Squarespace is an all-in-one website platform. So I'm assuming you've heard of Squarespace before.
Of course, yes, because this is the third time we're making this recording. But
So basically you can use it to create a website.
so it's a website that makes websites, which is
Yeah.
so weirdly meta. I wonder how they made their website. So that's one of those things, is like, how do you make a website that made a website that makes websites? Did they use like cube-spaced? And then you get into like the fifth dimension. So Nisha, you nailed me with this anteater. Like, it sailed through the air almost as easily as you'll sail through the tutorials on Squarespace. Because the future is squares. It's just squares that you drag and drop. And Squarespace allows you to just drag and drop and create an amazing website, maybe about anteaters.
Yeah, they use this thing called Fluid Engine.
So that sounds rad. That sounds like something that should be in like, Wave Race like 64.
It's like you can drag and drop anything, anywhere. So there's no limits. It's like you can customize it as much as you want.
You can customize it to your heart's desire, but always within the framework that Squarespace provides, so you don't have that awful aligning problem you get on Word. Do you know when you're like, I'm going to drop an image into my script, it'll look great. Like, you're getting all that with Squarespace. It's all just handled on the back end for you, allowing you to focus on making your website look as pretty as I do in this jacket.
Do you know you can also run your own online course?
Yes! If you want to monetize the thing that you do online, you can like create a subscription style service to your website. You can like allow for one-off or monthly payment. So you want to teach someone something, you think you've got value to add to the world. Like, if you want to teach people how to nail someone with an anteater from across the room, you could create a course on that. And it's pretty easy for me to keep track of the 2 friends I have in this room right now. But let's say I've got more than 2 friends. And they've so let's say I've got...
In this hypothetical world.
Yeah, let's say I've got 300 friends, and they all come onto my sick website about tossing anteaters. How do we keep in contact with them?
So I'm like lost which bit I'm...
Nisha's concentrating so hard.
So I'm like, are you talking about the mailing list or the analytics?
Well, the mailing list is a great way to keep track of people. You have a website, you want to keep people informed of your day-to-day dealings, you have a mailing list. But analytics are equally as important, though a seldom appreciated aspect of creating content online. As a content creator myself, I'm well aware that analytics are king. And having just a suite of tools that allows you to analyze and keep them all to hand is incredibly useful for any website, whether it is at the professional or the personal level.
There's a reason that Karl's in front of the camera.
And I'm here.
So thank you to today's host, Squarespace. Check out www.squarespace.com/biographics for a 10% off on your first purchase of a website /domain using the code Biographics. So thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring today's video. For most of the first 15 years of his reign, things continued pretty much the same way as they had done since he was 18. Cardinal Wolsey ran the country in the king's name, acquiring vast amounts of wealth for himself along the way, while Henry and his courtiers were spending even more to show off and have fun. But the good times weren't destined to last forever, as they often say, and the trouble, when it came, would be centred around the person of the king's wife, a pattern that was destined to repeat itself many times over the following years. Moving back to 1501, Henry's father, Henry VII, had made a contract to marry his heir, Prince Arthur, to Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. When Arthur died, Henry hoped to keep the alliance with Spain by having Catherine remarry Henry. She's a hell of a sentence. Henry wanted to remarry Henry, so Henry VII wanted him to remarry Henry VIII. This required a dispensation from the Pope, since canon law usually forbade a man from marrying his brother's widow. Henry and Catherine eventually did marry in 1509, right around the same time they were crowned king and queen. By all accounts, the marriage between the two was a happy one. Catherine was entirely devoted to the king, while Henry clearly loved Catherine, even though his wandering eye saw him take many mistresses over the course of their marriage, particularly when the queen was pregnant. The problem with the marriage was the couple's marked lack of success in producing offspring, particularly a male heir to the throne. Despite at least 6 pregnancies that we know of, Henry and Catherine only produced a single child that survived infancy, their daughter, Princess Mary. This posed serious dynastic problems for Henry. It was considered a king's first and foremost duty to ensure the peaceful succession of power by producing heirs, particularly male heirs. A woman had never ruled England in her own right, and leaving the kingdom to Mary if something happened to Henry was leaving the door open to a fight over the crown that could spill over into civil war that could destroy England. Some thought it was given to legitimising the king's bastard son, Henry Fitzroy, and making him the heir instead, but that posed its own issues that made a smooth transition unlikely. In 1536, that was no longer an option, as Henry Fitzroy died at the age of 17 after a long illness. Around the same time that questions about the succession were being raised, Henry became infatuated with one of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting, Anne Boleyn, an intelligent and ambitious young woman who is said to have had captivating eyes and who was at least 15 years younger than Catherine. Unlike the other women that struck Henry's fancy, Anne didn't want to be his mistress, to be used and discarded the way her own sister Mary had been a few years earlier. She strung him along, insisting that she would only give up her virginity to her lawful husband. By this point, Henry had become convinced that his marriage to Catherine had been cursed by God himself. He had married his brother's wife, and God was punishing him by denying him male children. He became determined to end his marriage to Catherine, marry Anne Boleyn, and live happily ever after. Well, this was much easier said than done, even for a king. Divorce was strictly forbidden by the Catholic Church. If he wanted his marriage annulled, he needed an excuse. So began what became known as the King's Great Matter, a 6-year saga stretching from 1526 to 1532, in which Henry's advisors did everything they could to sever the bonds of holy matrimony between the king and queen within the bounds of established canon law. The official position that Henry and his lawyers took was that Catherine had lied when she swore that Prince Arthur had died before the couple had slept together in the biblical sense. Because the marriage between Catherine and his brother had been consummated, it was in defiance of Leviticus 20:21 and should be annulled by the Pope. In the past, the Pope may have been sympathetic. It was not unheard of for monarchs to just jettison their wives for one reason or another and have the Pope kind of go along with it, and an excuse could usually be found or a loophole or something like that. But in this case, European politics interfered. Charles V, King of Spain and Holy Roman Emperor, one of the most powerful men in Europe at the time, was Catherine of Aragon's nephew. Charles loved his aunt, and he wasn't going to sit by and watch her be cast aside by some fat-ass king. And he just so happened to have Pope Clement VII within his power after an invasion of Italy in 1527 led to the sack of Rome and the Pope's virtual imprisonment within its walls. The legal case dragged back and forth for years as both sides dug in their heels. Catherine attracted quite a lot of sympathy across England and Europe and was tireless in determining an assertion that she was Henry's legal wife. The bottom line was that the Pope wasn't going to give Henry what he wanted, and since he was God's appointed representative on earth, he held absolute authority over doctrinal matters. But Henry was determined to have his way, even if he had to look outside the Catholic Church to do so. Such an open break with the Catholic Church would have been unthinkable just a few decades earlier. Henry himself had been a devoted Catholic all his life, but he was nowhere near as devout as Catherine was. But in 1517, Martin Luther had triggered the Protestant Reformation when he nailed his 95 theses criticising abuse within the Catholic Church to the door of the cathedral in Wittenberg. Luther's ideas spread across Europe, and there were many reformers in England by the time of Henry's Great Matter, including, crucially, Anne Boleyn and her court faction. After arranging the downfall of Cardinal Wolsey in 1529, the Boleyns convinced Henry that he didn't need to have the Pope's permission to do anything. He was, after all, the king, appointed by God. Should that not mean that he, and not the Pope, was the head of the English Church? So in 1532, Henry did exactly that, publicly breaking with the Catholic Church, announcing his marriage to Catherine was invalid and marrying and crowning Anne in her stead. Catherine was banished from the court, and anyone who opposed the new order of things ran the risk of being declared a traitor to the realm. John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester, and Sir Thomas More, who had served as Lord Chancellor after Wolsey's fall, were among Catherine's strongest supporters, and they suffered for it. When they refused to swear an oath declaring Henry was the head of the English Church, they were executed by having their heads chopped off. King Henry VIII's chosen method of execution for pretty much the rest of his reign. Henry's action shocked the rest of Europe and outraged the Pope, who had Henry excommunicated, the strongest sanction you could impose on a monarch. By law, an excommunicated king could have his realm invaded and his crown taken from him by any other Christian state. Most people, however, just blamed Anne Boleyn for wickedly leading the king astray. She was labelled the Babylon, among other unsavoury things. Even when condemning him, no one was willing to actually go against the doctrine of monarchs being sacred and exalted beings. To make matters worse, after all the trouble he'd gone to marry his second queen, things weren't going so well in the bedroom department. Anne was not content to play the role of a submissive ceremonial queen as her predecessor had done. She continued to be outspoken about political matters, something which infuriated King Henry. Neither was he all too happy when Anne refused to look the other way when he began to sleep with other women, making a scene about his mistresses in a very public way that was embarrassing to the king. But most unforgivable of all was the fact that the same childbearing issues that plagued Catherine's marriage to the king showed up again. Out of 4 pregnancies, only one produced a healthy baby, Elizabeth, another daughter, and it didn't really do anything to resolve Henry's succession issue. While the king remained popular, Anne's popularity, however, was never that high to begin with, and it plummeted during his reign. All kinds of plots were attributed to her. When Catherine of Aragon died, for example, in January 1536, it was widely believed that she'd been poisoned by Anne, even though it would later be determined she died of heart cancer. She made many enemies at court, including fatally Henry's new chief advisor, Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell, once a Boleyn ally, eventually determined that the Queen was a threat to his own position and that she had to go. In April 1536, allegations were made that Queen Anne had been unfaithful to Henry, sleeping with various men at court, including her own brother, George, Lord Rochford. By modern standards, the case was a travesty of justice. The only man that confessed to the adultery did so after being tortured, and it's widely believed that Anne had been framed. That didn't stop Cromwell, at Henry's behest, from arresting a group of courtiers and having them convicted of treason. Adultery of a queen was considered a treasonous act at the time because of the dynastic succession questions. Anne, her brother, and 4 other men were sentenced to death. Henry, meanwhile, had already moved on to somebody else. Jane Seymour, a woman he'd been courting for months before the allegations against Anne were made. On May 19th, Anne Boleyn was beheaded within the walls of the Tower of London. Less than 2 weeks later, Henry had married Jane. The undoing of the Boleyn faction seemed to bring a sense of normalcy back to court, but Henry refused to be reconciled with the Pope. He pushed ahead with his reforms to the English Church, including the most contentious issue of his reign, the dissolution of the monasteries. Over 500 abbeys, monasteries, and other religious houses throughout England and Wales were forcibly closed by the King's commissioners, with all of their assets transferred to the Crown. And this is like one of those, it's a pretty well studied and storied part of history, but the actual amount of knowledge that was lost during this period is not really known because it was lost. And there's some historians out there that says this is the English equivalent of the sacking and burning of the Library of Alexandria, because the amount of knowledge that was contained within the walls of these monasteries was virtually unique and wasn't easily replaceable. So when it was destroyed, all that knowledge was gone too. This was not only a religious matter. At a stroke, King Henry acquired 20% of the entire kingdom's land wealth, more than doubling the royal coffers. He used much of this land to win favour with the nobility, with nearly every peer of the realm benefiting from the dissolution. He made sure to keep enough of it for himself to make him the richest prince in Christendom. However, Cromwell, who had engineered the reforms in Henry's name, was richly rewarded for his efforts, earning himself more enemies in the process as he took the position formerly occupied by Wolsey. On October 12, 1537, Jane Seymour finally gave Henry what he so desperately desired, a son, Prince Edward. However, childbirth was a risky business for mother as well as child, and Jane died 12 days later, probably of postpartum infection. Henry was grief-stricken. In less than 2 years, all 3 of his wives had died. Admittedly, he was responsible for one of those, but still, those are bad odds. Eventually, however, Cromwell pushed him to marry again, not only for political reasons, but because the kingdom needed, and I quote, a spare, in case anything happened to the infant prince. Henry himself, after all, had been the second son. Few women would look at Henry as an attractive match at this point. One potential bride joked that she would only marry the king if she had a head to spare. With France and the Empire still cold towards England for, altogether predictable reasons, Cromwell turned to the Protestant League, an alliance of German principalities who were sworn enemies of Charles V and would make good allies for Henry. The Duke of Cleves, a small state that straddles the modern border of Germany and Holland, had two unmarried sisters, and one of them, Anne, was considered to marry King Henry. When Anne of Cleves arrived in England, Henry was, shall we say, less than impressed with her. Not only did he find her unattractive, but she apparently had, and I quote, evil smells about her, whatever the hell that means. Still, it was too late to back out without causing an international incident, so the two married in January 1540. However, Henry made few attempts to, shall we say, consummate the marriage, apparently finding the task, and I quote once again, unbearable. At this point, Henry was no prize stallion. In 1536, he was injured in a jousting accident. Told you. He suffered a leg injury which became infected, probably with osteomyelitis, and it never healed, troubling him for the rest of his days. He was often unable to leave his bed for days at a time, suffering frequent bouts of debilitating pain when the wound became inflamed. The injury kept him from exercise he'd enjoyed as a younger man, and this, combined with his ravenous appetite, caused his waistline to expand, shall we say, a lot. No one really said anything to the king to deter him from getting fatter and fatter, and instead the court simply started wearing wider cuts of clothes so they could match his majesty. It's actually a common trend with English monarchy. I believe there was one other king who was admittedly not as fat as King Henry VIII, but was, had considerable carriage, and they are believed to be the reason why it is not considered gentlemanly to button up all of the buttons on a waistcoat, right? It's off. You might see people say you leave the bottom button of a waistcoat unbuttoned, and that was supposedly started by this slightly overweight king who couldn't do so himself. So other members of his court just took to doing that as well, and then people start to copy, the aristocrats who were doing so without realizing the context, and it just became a thing. Like the telephone game of history just made that a thing people did without anyone realizing the reason why. Or maybe that's a completely made up story I saw on Horrible Histories once. Either way. By July, Henry was tired of his new wife and he'd already found a replacement, a 17-year-old Catherine Howard, a very attractive and vivacious young girl who, strangely enough, was a cousin of Anne Boleyn. Her family, the Howards, used his attraction to her to dispose of their enemy, Cromwell, who'd taken the heat for Anne of Cleves' marriage. Cromwell was arrested in 1540 and beheaded the next month. Anne, meanwhile, had been pensioned off, given the title of the Queen's sister, and their marriage annulled, the Queen marrying his teenage mistress directly afterwards. With Cromwell dead, the court split into rival factions, mainly on religious grounds, with the Reform Party led by Edward Seymour, the late Queen's brother, and the Conservative Party led by the Howards. The Conservatives were the ascendancy because of the new Queen, and Henry seems to be moving away from the Reform, with many of his new doctrines resembling the old Catholic ones. By this point, Henry was burning both Protestant and Catholics for heresy, confusing everyone with what his actual beliefs were. Then, in November 1541, another scandal erupted around the Queen. It came to light that not only had Queen Catherine not been a virgin before she married the king, but in fact she'd been carrying on an illicit affair with one of the king's chamber servants, Thomas Culpeper. Enraged, Henry stripped her of her title and threw her in prison. In February 1542, Catherine Howard, not yet 20 years old, was executed along with Culpeper and two other servants. The Howards would never recover from this scandal, and Seymour, the uncle of the future king, would basically dominate the court for the remainder of the realm. In July 1543, the king married for the 6th time. His new wife, Catherine Parr, was shall we say, experienced woman of the court who had already outlived two husbands, so at least they had something in common there. A secret Protestant, she'd survived an attempt by the Conservatives to have her accused of heresy, and apparently served as a great comfort to the increasingly ailing king. Henry's last years were spent in increasing agony as he began to suffer from ever more serious health conditions, including gout, as well as the pain caused by his leg wound. His great weight only made things worse, and on January 28, 1547, he died at the age of 55. He was buried at St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, next to the body of Jane Seymour. And just some little bonus facts here about the King's final days that people might find interesting. For one, I believe every single night before he went to sleep, he would have his servants brick up his doorway, so that he was that paranoid someone would just break into his room and kill him. And when he died, he had to be put into a specially made coffin, and his body, because of how large and overweight he'd been, literally exploded in the coffin, at which point some dogs came in off the street and began eating the residue that leaked through the seams of the casket. Yeah, I know I use casket and coffin there interchangeably. I know a coffin, you can take the entire lid off, where a casket has a lid. I believe it was a casket it was in. What an ignominious end for such a famous part and figure of English history, eh? As for what happened after King Henry's death, his son, aged 9, was crowned King Edward VI, but all the effort his father went through to secure the succession came to naught. Edward died just 6 years later, before reaching his majority. The crown would pass in turn to both of Henry's daughters, Mary from 1553 to 1558 and Elizabeth from 1558 to 1603. Mary, a devout Catholic like her mother, attempted to bring England back into the Catholic fold, burning hundreds of heretics and earning herself the nickname Bloody Mary. Elizabeth, meanwhile, became one of the most celebrated English monarchs of all time, the Virgin Queen as she would become known, who firmly established England as a Protestant realm and oversaw a golden age that set the stage for the British Empire. Both queens are said to have revered their father, despite the difficulties they and their mothers had with him. Difficulties is a hell of a way to word that. However, after the Tudor dynasty came to an end, history will prove not so kind to Henry VIII, and it seems obvious in retrospect that most of the people who suffered and died during King Henry's reign did so as a direct result of selfish and impulsive decisions the king himself had made, and that his advisors had merely taken the blame and the public scorn on behalf of their sovereign. As he got older, Henry became more tyrannical, increasingly subject to violent mood swings, probably caused by the pain of his leg injury. This was only made worse by the fact that the more power he gathered around himself, the more he began to believe he was infallible. Every decision he made had to be the right decision, no matter how rash, impulsive or contradictory it was to another decision he'd already made, simply because he was the king and what he said when, which was probably of little comfort to the literally thousands of people who died during his reign as a result of being branded heretics by the king and his policies. Henry VIII, though ridiculed today for his many wise and rotund visage, is undoubtedly one of the most important monarchs in English history. The Church of England, also known as the Anglican Church, is one of the largest Protestant denominations in the world, with the British monarch still serving as its titular head. The strife over religion would divide the country for more than a century after Henry's death, leading to a civil war and the deposition of more than one monarch. Even today, a law forbids Catholics from inheriting the crown, and until 2015, a royal who married a Catholic was ineligible to become king or queen. The British Empire would spread its Protestant faith everywhere it went, which in the 18th and 19th centuries was pretty much the entire globe. Many former colonies of Great Britain have large Protestant populations to this day because of this, including the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South Africa, Kenya, Tanzania and Zimbabwe. It's amazing to think about all the changes made to world history because one guy really wanted to get laid. So I hope everybody watching at home found this video entertaining, informative and educational. I certainly found the script to be all three of those things, and if you happen to enjoy the video, why not go give the writer, Ben Edelman, a follow on social media below, and while you're down there, do the same for me. You can also find links to my other channels, Wiki Weekends and Facting with Karl Smallwood, where I have an altogether more casual tone in these videos, as well as links to the sister channels for Biographics, Top 10s and Geographics, on which I'm also the interim host. And as always, I'd like to wish everybody out there, the day that they deserve.